trading de stratégie quantitative chez Barclays. Donc bienvenue. Merci à Professor Shiller de nous joindre ce soir sur sa route vers Davos. Donc on m'a demandé juste de faire une petite introduction en français, mais le reste de la conférence sera en anglais. Donc cette conférence est organisée en partnership avec Ossiam, qui est le partenaire de Barclays de choix pour la distribution en Europe, avec qui on travaille depuis 3 ans. Vous entendrez plus sur les 2 produits qu'on a lancés sous forme d'ETF sur les indices du professeur Shiller que l'on a développé. Donc je vais passer la parole à Christian Keller, qui est notre responsable des études économiques chez Barclays, et bien sûr au professeur Shiller, qui vont donner leur view sur l'actualité économique. Merci à vous.
Good afternoon. Thank you again very much for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I thank the organizers to come to invite me. I take it as one of the perks of my jobs to once in a while have the opportunity to speak with people like Professor Shiller, a Nobel laureate who probably doesn't need much introduction. I'll try it anyways. I will pick out a few points I think which are quite pertinent, and also which lead us to what we speak about here, going to speak about here today. I think what is striking to me when I was a student, in a way, how early you started to challenge things like the efficient market hypothesis. You know, I think there was an American Economic Review article in the early 80s, way before the stock market crash in 87. Then obviously, you came up with the famous book, Irrational Exuberance, really at the height of the market, warning of then what happened subsequently. And the interesting thing is that while on the one hand, people who study economics and finance know you through your publications, at the same time, you're also, in a way, very well known to practitioners, people who may have not read your articles, but know you for the Shiller index, know you for the KP index one or ratio, which are here for, which we hear more about later. And you've been making a lot of behavioral finance and behavior of people, really, and how it affects economics. And that's quite fascinating. I think in your recent books it came through, Fishing for Fools. And then before that there was Animal Spirits. And while on the one hand being someone who, is a person who measures things, who creates indices, etc., at the same time you realize that it was behavior, and often maybe irrational behavior, that really drives things. And in this context, I was fascinated by an article I read, which you just actually presented at the presidential address of the American Economic Association, which is called Narrative Economics. And it's a fascinating view of things. I think it's particularly pertinent against the backdrop of what we experienced in the last 6 months or so, which is events on the political front, which we didn't expect, but which have a certain narrative. And it's something I thought is absolutely astonishing that you come up with this new kind of branch of research at this point, which seems to be perfectly timed. Maybe that's how we start off. You give us a little bit of your latest thinking on theory, on economics.
All right. Well, yes, is this working?
It is working.
Yeah. So narrative economics is a term that I coined to describe something that has been going on to a limited extent in economic research. But the concept is not new. And I've traced elements of what I'm talking about back all the way to David Hume writing in the 1840s, 1740s, sorry. He was a Scottish philosopher who seemed to be very ahead of his time. But to go back to economic theory, what is it that drives all of these business fluctuations that we have? That's a very primitive question before you ask about economic theory. What's driving it all? There are some theorists, for example, who advanced what's called the real business cycle, said that it's all technological progress. Those are the exogenous shocks that affect the economy, and then there's a transmission mechanism. Why they said it was all technology, I don't know, but it was a gift. But, it seems like economists have a view of the world that, yes, the economic system responds in an optimal way to shocks. And what are the shocks? Well, there's technology. There's also war. Everything else is rational and right. I never believed that, by the way, and maybe you don't either, but some of you don't anyway. So I was thinking about what is it that really drives the business cycle, which is a regular event. And I decided to emphasize narratives. But I'm not being very original in emphasizing narratives, because in every other social science, they're big. And in the news media, they'll explain some phenomenon. They'll say, well, the narrative is such and such. So what is a narrative? It's a simple explanation, or a story, especially a story, particularly a human interest story. So if you want to look for examples, I would go no further than Donald J. Trump, okay, who generates narratives all around a common theme. And what is the theme? Well, you know this as well as I, but it's something about brilliant billionaire makes deals. This is the last chance for America, because if we don't take this opportunity with a clear, original man who doesn't care about political correctness but cares about you, and you know what I'm saying. There is a story, and it spreads. But why does it spread? We have this term "go viral," which is a relatively new term, but I date it all the way back to David Hume, who seemed to be saying that, not in those words. But some stories just have contagion. So I think we should refer to mathematical epidemiology for our theory that stories, and I'm referring back to people in the medical field who talk about spread of viruses. And the simplest epidemiological model has a contagion rate and a removal rate. Those are the two parameters. And you can trace forth an epidemic. It rises for a while and then falls. I'm thinking that this dynamics underlies the business cycle. And that was the theme of my paper. And it started, just to give you one example that I emphasize. Have you heard of the Laffer curve? This is a long time ago. In 1974, Art Laffer, who was an economist, was in a restaurant with two White House top leaders, and he drew a little diagram on a napkin. That's a story that was told by Jude Wanniski in a book that he published 4 years later in 1978. And it just went viral. I mean, I don't know, maybe most of you have heard this story. Why? What a silly story. In the story of a restaurant and drawing a diagram on a napkin. But it actually helped. It was in 1979 that Margaret Thatcher was elected, was made prime minister with a very conservative bent. In 1980, it was Ronald Reagan, right after the Laffer curve. By the way, the Laffer curve arrived in France, and I check it out on the. It only gets something like 10,000 hits in French. So there's some cultural. It wasn't contagious in France. Maybe the French tastes are a little different. And then you got Mitterrand as your president, the first socialist here. So some of these dynamics really matter, and it's stories. That was the theme of my address.
So then, just in practicality, what would you suggest that economists and people who are in financial markets should start to try to track narratives by, obviously today we have computational linguistics. You just put in certain words and see how often it appears, and that way to measure whether, I was going to say the sentiment swings, but in this case the narrative swings in another way.
Well, this is already happening. So what I'm saying here is not entirely original. In fact, I can already count. There were 31 papers at our meetings out of 2,000 that did word counts, textual analysis. And as semantic search improves, and we will be seeing more and more of this. I think it's a new direction for economic analysis and financial analysis. So but we haven't really gotten very far into it yet. It's not as big as it will be.
But putting your prediction hat on now, if this is true that we are now at a time when narratives change, and you mentioned the 80s, and there's a lot of comparison now of what's going on in the US now with the Reagan era, and Trump probably in some ways would like to be seen as a new Reagan. Do you think this is last year has been a crucial turning point, which is crucial for investors in a way for years to come now, that we have a, so to say, a pivotal point of change from where
well, the
we continue
immediate
to go?
relevance to the current situation is that this is a post-truth society we live in. This is a term that was added, the Oxford English Dictionaries added this phrase in 2016. Suddenly we're aware that stories don't need to be true but it's not really new. It's gotten worse. And one reason it's gotten worse, I think, is because of the internet. The internet seems to have resulted in lower profits for legitimate news media. And so many others crop up that also specialize in tailoring the news to the wishes of various groups within society. And so you stop reading the main newspaper, you read some small fraction, newspaper that appeals only to a fraction of the population. And it seems to be leading us to a time when it's easier to do fake news.
My question would be then, however, how long can a narrative hold up if it's not then backed up by reality? And you could, of course, say perception breeds reality, but ultimately, if the numbers don't add up, if growth doesn't come, we had it in Brexit. You may win an election, but then afterwards the pound still falls. The pound, the value of the pound, you can't build a narrative around it. It's going weaker, right? And now putting that on the US, how long can a narrative hold if it turns out to be, just built on post-truth kind of
Well,
ideas?
I've been doing counts of narratives using textual analysis. And I noticed that some narratives seem to survive an exceptionally long time, regardless of the truth. And one of them, you can just search for Karl Marx, for example, who sprung into the international prominence in 1848 during the revolutions that were there. He kind of realized the opportunity and published the Communist Manifesto right that year. He didn't wait around, and he got it published in multiple languages. So he was a Mr. on the spot, and that kind of made it his in some sense. His narrative didn't peak. They tend to be hump-shaped. Epidemics, whether of diseases or of narratives, they rise for a while and then they fall. His epidemic didn't peak until the 1970s. So it was like more than a century after. Now, the question is the Communist Manifesto, is the communist view correct or not? Nobody can answer that, right? It has all different aspects. It's right about some things, wrong about other things. It spreads despite whatever it has some appeal. And so it has had a very consistent contagion rate. It has been decaying now for 40 years. Adam Smith beats Karl Marx, though, because he died in 1790, and he didn't peak until the 1880s. And he's down a little bit from his peak popularity. Why? Why is Adam? There's something contagious about his story, and that you can have very quick epidemics and you can have slow ones. Something can interfere with it. Some of these internet meme epidemics, they come and go in months. So the theme is that there is a theory of epidemics that I think economists should start paying attention to.
Well, I guess some Europeans may view Trump as a kind of an epidemic in terms of
yes, absolutely.
Policies now. But taking from what you say, we probably haven't peaked yet, so we should basically be ready for this to continue somewhat.
And then maybe what you're suggesting is it would suggest that financial markets are going to continue.
I was going to say it would look like, that if the narrative holds, and then it continues and we have some further to go before, I guess there would be possibly some moment of truth, or it becomes reality that actually, the hope for, deregulation and whatever you have as part of it kind of does fire up the U.S. economy.
I think analysts should be thinking very carefully about Donald J. Trump. It has some, because it's not just narratives, it's also what he actually does with policy. But the other thing is, you wonder why financial markets haven't discounted Trump in more dramatically. I would have thought markets should jump a lot more than they did on November 8th, because that was a big turning point. When he, what more clear a surprise? And you think that was an important surprise. So markets are up in the U.S. 6% since Donald Trump's election victory. That's not much. Markets doubled under Obama, of course, over years. You'd think there should have been a more dramatic jump in the markets. It suggests to me that markets are really not as responsive as you think. Now, it also is that we don't know what the Trump narrative has two sides to it, so he could bring disaster, too.
But that was my thought. I'm fascinated that you say markets haven't reacted enough. I thought markets were possibly interpreting what Trump says in a very asymmetric way, in the sense of filtering only the positive news about, deregulation, possibly doing infrastructure investment and, doing pro-growth efforts, while kind of neglecting the risks of a trade war.
Right, right. So maybe it isn't clear, but it is something of a puzzle that it didn't react more one way or the other to what looks like some of my conservative friends or pro-Trump friends call it a revolution. They said to me, these are mainly my relatives in Detroit who are pro-Trump. Nobody in New Haven seems to talk pro-Trump. At least I haven't met them yet. It's so regional, which is another sense that it has something to do with narrative and psychology. But my cousin says, Bob, you should go to a Trump rally. You have to experience that. There is so much excitement and so much a sense that this is it. We've got to vote, get everyone out to vote for Trump because he's the only hope. And it is so exciting to see the hope he has for a great America. I guess I believe them, that they are really excited. So you'd think that would have a bigger effect on markets, but maybe not,
But would you define the narrative closer a bit? I mean, what is Trump's narrative? Is it it seems to be one of anti-globalization, a lot of things that were thought to be the drivers of growth in the past 20, 30 years, outsourcing, tapping emerging markets through global value chains, etc. It seems to be a narrative that goes against this. Would you agree? Or?
Well, okay, the Trump narrative is the product of a great amount of thought, starting with Trump's father, who was very much into marketing and using the Trump as a brand name, and conveyed this to his son. So it's the work over the better part of a century. And Trump is fascinated by narratives and how he can use them to his advantage. That's different. He also took a risk-taking strategy of on-the-edge narratives that should have collapsed his campaign. The other Republican candidates weren't going to take those risks. But he just was in, he does have a risk-taking mentality. A major part of his narrative is, I'm not politically correct. There's a growing sentiment that political correctness is the bane of clear thinking. All these politicians are saying the same stuff, and they just are so fascinated to hear someone say something that they may have thought themselves. And it's so fascinating to them to watch someone insult these pretentious. Now, another thing is that I think that there's an increasing resentment in the United States, and in other countries as well, I'm sure, about the elite cosmopolitan class that is running things, and they go to these top elite universities that would reject me. I'm talking generic me. And I'm just bitter about that. And on top of that, they have special preferences for minority groups who are no more talented than I am, and they get in because this is what goes on in their mind. And so they're just angry about it, and they're not going to play along anymore with this political correct talk. They just love to see somebody. And Trump knew, and what he did, he was kept generating, by tweeting narratives, he kept generating news that would spread, would go viral. And everyone heard about it. People who liked him and people who didn't. Everyone heard about it.
Now, two things, and we were going to move away from Trump at some point as well, but I think it is fascinating because it does in a
Boris Johnson does this too, somewhat.
I was going to say that I had two more questions. One is, to what extent is this now a phenomenon that goes beyond the US? It's really something that affects Western democracies where something similar has been taking place. That's one question. And how do you think about it as someone who watches this maybe from afar? As we say, Brexit, we have elections coming up in various European countries as well. But the second question is, so far, Trump's strategy or tactics of, shocking people, breaking political correctness, etc., was to a domestic audience. He had to win a domestic election. He had to fight against, opponents from its own party, but it was all domestic. The interesting thing is that next week, January 20th, he becomes a president and suddenly takes us to an international stage. Now, beating a fellow Republican candidate in a kind of a debate is one thing. If you use that same strategy with the president of China, the question is, will it play out the same way, right? And I wonder whether this is where we're going to see the big shocks for investors possibly in the coming month or quarters.
Well, that's what I worry about, that it could play out badly. He could create an international crisis. Now, one thing he has going for him is that Xi Jinping and all kinds of international, they know he's a little bit of a live wire, and you can't take anything from him. You got to give him a little space, let him do his antics. And so maybe they won't be so reactive to him. Also, that he says something and he'll take it back later. So maybe it'll be all right. That's what I'm hoping.
Yeah, but I guess, and I don't know whether you looked at it in your studies. I mean, some narratives, they can also create counter narratives, I would assume. So I don't know whether, there is obviously strong emotions also within Chinese society, for example. They don't like to be insulted. And, can leaders really control narratives? Or this one was a top-down from Trump. But there could be a narrative coming, from the bottom up in China where people just get very angry about being put down.
I don't think Trump is in control of narratives. They have a life of their own. He is a risk taker he was just in this for the fun of it or something like that. He likes to talk big and he enjoys doing this. He shouldn't have succeeded, but somehow a sequence of random events helped him succeed. I guess risk takers live with that. And
So I guess one thing to take away is, in a way, that there is a certain risk that the kind of technique, or this narrative technique he applied, may suddenly look different once he takes it to the international stage as no longer president-elect, but a president in charge. It seems that that's what you would see as a significant risk somehow.
But it might take years to play out.
Oh, you think it might years?
He might get reelected in 4 years. Now, he might actually... Now, I like to compare him... it's not a completely accurate comparison, but with Calvin Coolidge, President of the United States in the 1920s, who's similar to Trump in that he hired the equivalent of a billionaire for his Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, who was head of Mellon Bank, a founder, I guess, of Mellon Bank, and wanted to cut taxes. And they even used the term trickle down. They didn't say trickle down economics, but the idea was, cut the taxes on the rich. It will spur the economy and it will make everybody better off. So that worked pretty well. The 20s, now I'm just talking about the U.S., but the 20s were very successful economically. They also had a lot of corruption and tricks played, and it ended in 1929 with the stock market crash and then the Great Depression. So that's a sign. There was a narrative. It was a trickle-down narrative of trust business. In fact, the way it was named, Calvin Coolidge said, "The business of America is business." Famous quote. It was replicated. It's like Trump's theme. And so people had a sense that this is a pro-business nation, and exciting things are happening. And it worked for a while. So, but again, it ultimately left us with some bad outcomes. So I think Trump is not in control of these things. He is just he experiments with narratives. He is the lucky guy. There must be another 100 or more Donald Trumps who tried something similar and it didn't work out for them. But he's there. He probably won't continue to be as lucky. But that's what randomness brings.
Okay. So it would seem that if what you say, if this kind of this narrative now, basically brought alive the animal spirit that maybe was a bit lacking, right, in the U.S. And if it doesn't get disrupted by something, potentially as a clash with China, so this could still go for some years and could fire up the stock market continuously.
Right. I think he is an inspiration. I recommend his book with Meredith McIver. The title is How to Get Rich. Okay. And I think she wrote the whole book, but you could tell that it's his write it down. How to Get Rich, 2004, I think. But it shows unmistakably his imprint. She interviewed him and wrote it. So the theme emphasized in the book was think big and live large. Say, don't monkey around with little ideas. Go for really big ones. And you want to walk with the big shots. Live large. You want to get invited to Chelsea Clinton's wedding, which he did by donating to Hillary Clinton. He said that he's quite open about it during one of the debates. He said, I donated to Hillary Clinton and I got invited to her wedding. Why is that important? It's important. You got to be seen with the big people. So that's his whole life. He wants his name on every building. And he also has to live this. He has to have his yachts and his beautiful entourage of sexy women. And he's been playing this strategy that his father actually wasn't. His father was loyal to his wife, but different personality. But some of it came from. He's developed it, and it's work. Another thing is the TV show, The Apprentice. Which had him as a reality TV show, and it had him as a advisor, a mentor to young entrepreneurs, and that was perfect for him. It developed him it's worth amazing amount of publicity dollars, and so The Apprentice. Now, whenever you see a successful narrative, the idea of the great but tough businessman mentoring young people. Great reality TV show. It gets copied all over the world. And in other countries that have copied The Apprentice, sometimes the guy, the rich man, ends up in politics. Notably in Brazil, João Doria became elected the mayor of São Paulo. He's another Trump. It's the same. I don't mean he is the same as Trump, but he's riding on the same narrative. And they go for a while. Until somehow they can get discredited. Another example is Senator Joe McCarthy, who in the early 1950s ran investigations against communists in America. And he got tremendous publicity. Everyone was following him. And then it suddenly turned sour because he was on TV shows chastising alleged communists. And suddenly it looked bad.
No, just we cannot. If you hold it,
I have to hold it closer.
No, if you hold it too close, I think it makes noise.
Oh, okay.
But I don't know whether you have a view, but just asking, since you since you follow narratives, you obviously have seen what's happened in the U.S. Now you're here in Paris. I mean, we have elections in France. We have the Brexit debate still upcoming. We have elections in Germany, Netherlands. Is there anything to take away from what we have seen in the past 6 to 8 months for Europe? Are you concerned that the narrative is moving over here, or could there be a counter narrative where Europe now tries to actually distinguish itself from Trump as a reaction? How would you?
Well, the other people who've used narratives very well are terrorists with bombing. That really generates a narrative, and that also has created a mistrust of foreigners, and it's currently in our environment, or people of other religions. And that's definitely, you know this, I don't have to tell you, it's a concern. and the mistrust of institutions like the European Union or NATO. So I don't know where this is going, but yeah, I find myself worried.
Maybe more abstract, and not going into elections. But I know that you also have done some research on, or you're concerned about the implications of, automation, artificial intelligence, etc., and what that would mean for going forward. For basically people finding jobs, and whether that could further lead to larger inequalities that apparently, so some studies are behind the rise of some of more of the extreme views, or the discontent about globalization that has been driving these parties, including Trump.
Now, this is another powerful narrative, the narrative of new technology like driverless cars or Airbnb or Uber, that with information technology changing our lives. But it hasn't seemed to have been connected to by political storytellers. And I don't know why that is. So when Pulsonomics ran a survey of attitudes toward, and I think there's been others too, that people don't say they're very scared about being replaced by a robot. But maybe 20% or 30%, especially lower income people do express some fear. But I think it's an underlying anxiety that that people don't know what they'll be doing in 10, 20 years, or what will their children be doing. And so it makes them open to alternatives that, so what Trump did is he doesn't have a solution to the information technology problem. So he made it out as if it was a Mexican problem of Mexicans coming in and stealing your jobs, which was an exaggeration. But at least he was addressing it, and it took that form. But I think that the fear of automation may get worse in coming years when it becomes more and more apparent that like they're increasingly replacing cashiers. That can now with Amazon Go, it's much, if that develops, much more effective in replacing cashiers, replacing drivers, truck drivers and taxi drivers with driverless cars. As those things become more and more visible, it might generate, the narrative is already there, but people haven't been connected to their own welfare. And I think they will be worried about it.
But see, this is where I wonder where the connection is between what is a narrative. So, for example, Trump's argument that is, Mexican workers stealing away the jobs, which to some extent may be true, as jobs, have been outsourced. But then something that I would call reality, that technology makes it possible in the future to essentially do with machines jobs that so far have been done by humans. It's a narrative, but at the same time, that's a fact, right? And so at some point, there's a clash, right, between a narrative that's not really substantiated by facts and something else that may be just a growing narrative, but actually it's much more forceful because it's reality. Don't you see this kind of discrepancy?
Well, this is post-factual society, remember. So what did Donald Trump do during his campaign? He gave stories about rapes by Mexicans of American women, things like that. When people pointed out, statistically, they don't do that any more than anyone else. And reputable news media said, why are you making something of this? He just ignores it, and he keeps telling stories. And Breitbart News does that, stories about immigrants committing crimes. And so it's not, the stories are correct. You can find stories of immigrants committing crimes. But they just, Bannon, who runs Breitbart News, will now be the House Chief of Strategy. So, I mean, these people are strategizing, and they really understand you can't criticize their news as fabricating stories. These stories weren't fabricated. They just keep presenting them. And it's a distortion to present these stories. But I don't see why there's any reality check on that.
Yeah, I guess I just wonder whether one can distinguish narratives that in a way are ultimately, based on post-truth or, things that are actually irrelevant but are blown up or not even true, and narratives that are really just there to transport something that it is true. As I said, automatization, technology advance, etc. Those are narratives that actually become very, very relevant for investors and that are, or for societies as a whole. And that to me seems to be the difference possibly between a narrative that can sustain and one that will ultimately collapse.
Well, okay, so the question is what determines the contagion rate of a thought virus? And I think, truth is part of it. But I think narratives have this amazing... we don't understand yet what drives successful narratives. And just as we don't understand yet what drives successful movies. There's a literature on predicting success of motion pictures, which attempts to statistically verify what... Now, it's true that a motion picture that is a repeat of another successful motion picture has a better chance of success. So you can partially predict movies. But the really big blockbuster movies are those that just break out in another direction. And people are just very bad at predicting. There's something about the human imagination. Or how about this? How about predicting which songs will become hit songs? I think it's very hard. You'll find a lot of songs that you like, but they won't make it. And what is it? There's something about creativity in the human mind, and there are moments when someone just clicks with some theme or idea or story, and they can't explain why. And they may never be able to do it again. There's this one, like singers or songwriters will have one hit, and maybe a few marginal ones after that. And so that's what I'm quoting David Hume as saying. There's some random creations in the human mind that can just go viral. And
so that is the element, I guess, of Nassim Taleb has been talked about a lot as well in the terms of the randomness of things, right? And
Fooled by Randomness is a great book.
And that possibly investors would do well, similar, I guess, like some angel investors do, just randomly or spread investments into startups and just hoping, not that they actually can predict which one will make it, but just hope that if I put in 100, some of them will have such high multiples later, that they will make it. Does that like kind of I guess confirm with the theory of narratives, I assume?
That's right. So a lot of randomness is introduced through the narrative process. And then there's a principle called historical determinism, which some historians have noted, that history writers like to explain it as a sequence of events in such a way that it sounds like somebody should have seen things coming. So historians will say, why was there World War II? And if you read their account, it seems like it was inevitable. You should have known it was coming in the 1930s. Well, if you go back to the 1930s, you will find that there were people predicting World War II, but it was like a shot in the dark. There was a book written by Johannes Steele in 1934 called World War II, okay? And it sold. He was interviewed on the radio. And I'm wondering what the impact of that was on the Depression. I can't figure it out. Actually, I went back and read his book, World War II, and I thought, this guy was really smart. He was just looking at the Nazis, using his personal judgment, and he said, these guys are up to no good, and it's going to be war. And he just went out and said that. But after that, he had trouble duplicating the success of that. But he just had a moment of creative insight, and it affected some people. I think it was part of the Depression story, that this horrible war might be coming.
So, but in the current situation, now I said earlier, you weren't shy in the 80s, to already refer to excessive valuation potentially in markets and pointing out that behavior was driving it, not necessarily ideas about efficiency. And you did it in 2000 with your term, irrational exuberance at a point when markets were extremely highly valued in the US, the equity market. Where do you think are we now? I mean, should we be concerned? I mean, we're going to hear about KP later, about ways trying to, come up with some idea of valuations and making judgments whether we are overpriced or still at a fair price or can go further?
Well, my judgments about whether something are overpriced or not is mechanical, and I have the CAPE ratio.
Yeah.
But underlying that theory is the idea that narratives are human constructs that we could someday understand better than we do. But they are, they're always, you focus back on old narratives, they keep coming back, unless they've decayed beyond, so the Great Depression is an old narrative that comes back. But actually, we have reinterpreted it. So I did a count for a Great Depression going back to 1900 on Google Ngrams to see how often that phrase appeared. Remarkable. Wouldn't you think that phrase was popular during the Great Depression? Well, there was a blip upwards. The word Great Depression was coined. I'm not sure when it was coined. It was used by Franklin Roosevelt as early as 1932. There was a book in 1934 by Lionel Robbins with the title, The Great Depression. And so people started to use it, and they started to capitalize the G and the D in the 30s. But it wasn't used that way. It was then gradually rising through the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and it peaked around 2008 or 2009. So, you wouldn't know this, but we were getting more, and we were defining it differently. Back in the Great Depression, if you can go back in a time machine and ask someone, what is this Great Depression? First, you would get blank. What? Oh, what is this Great Depression? I guess you're referring to the hard times we're going through. They knew they were going through hard times, but they didn't frame it like we did. So what happened in 2009 was this sense that the Great Depression is back. And what is the Great Depression? Well, people didn't care to hear about Franklin Delano Roosevelt or any of that stuff. It's very simple. The Great Depression is everybody gets scared. They run to take their money out of the bank. The banks all fail. The stock market crashes. Everything goes to hell, I will say. And lots of people are unemployed. And then we're stuck in this collapsed system. That was a narrative which had developed over decades. And it eventually... but now it's fading very fast since 2008.
Trying to, in a way, summarize a little bit this kind of fascinating discussion. I walk away thinking that, there has been definitely a change in narrative to the more positive from an economic perspective, in particular in the US.
Right.
And it seems to be
and
going global.
Trump, yeah.
There's probably also some feedback where we see a lot of the sentiment indicators being influenced, and that, of course, can have a feedback loop into the real economy. And would you then agree that even if your CAPE, your more mechanistical ratios would tell you we may be reaching values that are no longer necessarily close to what you define as fair or historically fair, but we could still go much further because of a narrative continues?
Yeah, I'm interested in that. So the Great Depression narrative is fading fast. The Trump narrative is replacing it. And it is possible that you might want to invest USA right now. Do it now. Don't wait. And you have to be ready to get out. I don't know, though. So
I guess we should put in secular stagnation in Google search, and I bet if it probably in the last few months it already collapsed in terms of how often it is cited, right? It used to be probably in the early 2016 something that was discussed a lot, and now
not in Google. Google Ngrams ends in 2008, but I can do it with other LexisNexis or ProQuest, and I've done that. Secular stagnation is still there, though. That's a theory that was developed in the 1930s, near the end of the Great Depression, and associated with Alvin Hansen, who wrote about it. And it's a theory that something is fundamentally wrong with our demand. Alvin Hansen emphasized lower birth rates. Did you know that birth rates dropped spectacularly in the U.S. during the Great Depression? That's a sign of the fundamental angst. It was really people were profoundly upset by the narrative then. Oh, there was an interesting story. Under the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt set up various government expenditure projects, and somebody said, why don't we hire someone to interview all the ex-slaves, because the last remaining slaves after the emancipation in 1865 were still alive. They were 90 years old. And so they went and interviewed the slaves. And what was it like being a slave? And you know what happened? They weren't interested in talking about what it was like being a slave. The typical answer was, oh, it was fine. I had a good master, no problem. But the person wanted to talk about the Great Depression, and it was hard to get them off topic. The Great Depression, they didn't say Great Depression, but the hard times. He said, I was better off as a slave. One of them at least said that. So you can see that the culture changes and the narratives change. We haven't really put ourselves back in the mindset of the Great Depression in 2009 because we thought we avoided it. We have these heroes, the central banks, who did this dramatic policy change. So that is fading. Now it's morphing again into something completely new and different, the narratives.
Yeah, I do find it fascinating, and I find it fascinating how quick conversation topics suddenly change away from something that was driving it until a few months ago, and now it seems to have moved away. Much less talk about the, potential potentially never having inflation coming back up, and all these things. It seems to fade very quick, as you say. But I also want to give a chance to the audience, maybe to ask a question or two. I think we still have a little bit of time, maybe to engage. If there are any questions that emerged in a way from people following us over the past hour or so. Yes.
You mentioned Coolidge and also the Harding administration. It was a time of pro-business administration with currency and fine times for stock exchange. But is it a responsibility for the Great Depression with deregulation?
You're talking about the Harding administration. Now, Harding died in 1923, so it's more Coolidge was vice president, and he took over. And I think of him as a tax cutter. I don't know about deregulation. There must have been. So are you asking whether that's a model for? I think it is a model for Donald Trump in a sense. He must have been more flexible with regulations because of his pro-business attitude. Coolidge must have been. But I don't know what drove the success, whether it was Coolidge or... The part of what happened in the 1920s was dramatic invention. The most dramatic invention of the 1920s was radio and electricity. You get electricity to your house, and radio was just amazing because now you could listen to all these different shows and stations right in your house. You could hear from far away, and that developed into a narrative of success. Then Calvin Coolidge began giving talks on the radio, and you could hear the president for the first time ever. So it's a complicated story. I don't want to oversimplify the narrative. But there was definitely a sense of, during the 1920s, of opportunity and freedom. It was also a time when women were given new freedom. They could go to a bar without a male accompanying and just have a drink. They wore short skirts. People noticed these things. The 1930s was very different culture. They were now modest. They were more religious. So the narratives are. So I don't want to blame Calvin Coolidge for everything, or Herbert Hoover.
But are you excited? He mentioned regulation. Are you excited about the potential deregulation of the U.S. economy? Is that something that could really provide us with the real impetus that later will substantiate, maybe, in a way, the hype of Trumponomics?
I was shocked to hear that one of Trump's nominees, I think the name is O'Neill, for the head of the Food and Drug Administration, has been advocating eliminating the efficacy requirement for selling of drugs. The Food and Drug Administration was set up in 1904, and George Akerlof and I talked about it in our book, Fishing for Fools. It was set up because the American Medical Association and other medical experts got a lot of publicity for the fact that most patent medicines sold on pharmacies were fraudulent. It was all nonsense. They would put some magic herb in something and they claim it cures tuberculosis. And they had nothing to back it up except letters from satisfied customers. So it was a big step forward that we finally eliminated this fraud. This guy wants to go back pre-1904. It's just astonishing to me. So maybe GDP will go up by loosening that FDA requirement. But it's going to be increased GDP in terms of fraudulent medicines. And that's not good at all.
Don't you think there are some regulations that if removed, they actually would accelerate growth without doing harm? I mean, I know there's a lot on the medicine, on
Right.
environmental standards, but there's some research on the US that productivity has been quite low and has been quite low during a time over the last 10, 15 years whereby regulation in many areas, licensing, etc., has been going up apparently.
Yeah, well, Alan Kruger, who's a labor economist at Princeton, has been arguing recently that while labor unions have gotten weaker in the last half century in the United States, offsetting that has been an increase in licensing requirements for occupations. Now, this is sometimes, it looks like it's gone to crazy length. Milton Friedman wrote about this in his 1963 book, Capitalism and Freedom, that we license barbers, for example. And Milton Friedman said, why do we need to license a barber? You know whether you like the haircut or not. And he thought it was a barrier to entry. I think I've thought about that. Maybe it isn't. Maybe some licensing requirements for barbers would weed out some people who might spread infection, spread AIDS or things like that. But maybe he's right about barbers. So I think that there must be some bad regulations that we should throw out, and we don't need to license everything. But it's replacing other. It's creating some monopolies, and that's economic inefficiency.
Is there another question maybe from the audience?
I want to be convinced by this kind of causality from theories to facts, because I can say that we can have the perfect reverse causality from
Right.
facts to ideas. Especially if I take your example of the Laffer curve. We know the Laffer curve since we have conservative revolutions with bad politics linked to Keynesianism in the 70s. So maybe the causality is totally reversed. How to test that?
Yes.
I
Well,
think that, we should. I don't know whether I've heard it.
Yeah.
This idea of reverse causality. I think
Right.
it's a very important one. I think you do mention it even in
I
the
do
paper.
mention it in my paper. So we'd like to. The way you infer causality is by running controlled experiments. It's hard to do that for macroeconomics because if you're going to try to affect the whole economy, it's difficult to do an experiment. There's ethical problems with doing that. But there have been many experiments about the effect, and that are controlled experiments with a careful design where you have an experimental group and a control group, and they're randomly allocated. There are many of those in the field of marketing, education, criminology, philanthropy. I refer to these in a paper. So let me just tell you that controlled experiments have shown, let's take marketing, for example. If you look at television advertisements, the typical 30-second spot on television is typically a narrative. What it will typically do is they'll identify your demographic. So if this television show is watched by middle-aged men, then they will be targeting you, and they'll show a skit involving somebody else like you who buys the product and endorses it. But it's also, there's a little interest, humor or something in the skit. Now you wonder, do they know that works? Absolutely, they know that work. They've run, it's in the marketing journals. It absolutely works. They also play soft, relaxing music in the background. Now, are they doing that just to be nice? You know, let's play some nice music? No, it's in the marketing literature. They've run controlled experiments, and they know that it works to make you more receptive to the ad. All of this is the result of some careful thought. It's not reverse causality. In this case, it's actually, and I think we can infer from these. Now some of, in the case of narratives that are involved with, yes, the Laffer curve might be partly, but if it were reverse causation, I would have expected to see more growth in the Laffer curve throughout the whole Thatcher-Reagan era. And it doesn't seem to follow that dynamic. It seemed to grow until around 81, 82, and then start dropping. Now, so I don't know, though. There must be some feedback from Reagan and Thatcher toward Laffer curve. And I don't mean to say that everything is so simple. On the other hand, I do think that it's a major part of what drives the economy is the emergence of creative new narratives.
I think this is a very very good way to end this. In a way, we come back full circle in a way to the original start of our little discussion here. The power of narratives and the fact that as an investor, while on the one hand having CAPE and other tools in a way to mechanistically and in a very thorough way examining the mechanics of valuations. At the same time, these narratives play a big role. And I guess that's maybe also where we still have the need for interpreting them and kind of being someone who is actively managing things and tries to kind of capture what the latest narrative is. Because it does seem something that we can measure with the computational technology that we have now, but it's probably very difficult to still to put a number to it the way we can do it with balance sheets and other things.
Well, we should be putting numbers, though. Eventually.
Yeah. Eventually, yeah. Thank you very much. I assume we have a next speaker and bring us back to the CAPE. Thanks.
Donc, bonsoir à tous, je suis Fabien Dornier, le directeur de la gestion d'Ossiam. Alors, je remercie Barclays de m'avoir mis devant une double difficulté qui est de parler après un prix Nobel et avant le cocktail surtout. Donc je vais essayer de faire concis et précis pour que je ne retarde pas trop pour la suite de la soirée.